Welcome back to part 5 of this Django course. Now previously we've built our models, serializers and views, but up until now our API is essentially just a black box. So in this video I'm going to show you how to transform it into a fully documented interactive API that developers can explore, test and understand instantly. So let's get into it. So if you missed part 4 of this series where we set up our views for our Django server, then definitely go back and revisit that video, because in order to complete this part, to generate the API documentation, we're going to need our views, and we're actually going to need everything else that came before that. So our models and our serializers as well. We've actually done a lot of the hard work already in terms of setting up our models, our serializers and our views. And now what we can do is we can leverage this package, DRF Spectacular, which is going to automatically generate an OpenAI schema for us. It's going to create interactive Swagger and Redoc documentation, and is going to give us full control over the documentation that gets generated if we want to add any more metadata, tags, or any custom components as an example. So now, rather than a developer coming in and reading through the code and spending days and weeks on end just trying to understand your code base, you can also provide them with really intuitive and clean documentation as well. So the first thing that we need to do, quite obviously, is we need to install this DRF Spectacular package. So just by running this command, open up a terminal, activate the virtual environment, and just pip install DRF Spectacular. Pretty simple, as you'd expect. Now what we need to do is we need to do a bit of configuration. So if we open up our settings.py file, and we want to copy this setting, so the default schema class, into our REST framework object. So if we come into settings.py and just find the REST framework object, here we go, add this at the bottom as a new key value. Very simple. And then once again in the settings.py, we want to add the DRF Spectacular app within the installed apps. You can also add this additional app as well, the DRF Spectacular sidecar, if you're interested in using some of the Swagger UI offline assets. However, I'm just going to stick to this one for now. So copy this, come over to your installed apps array and paste this in here. Great. And then lastly, we just want to add some settings for Spectacular in particular. So if I copy this, and I can put this just at the end of the settings file, or wherever you prefer to put it. This is just going to provide some metadata about the documentation that's going to get generated. So we can add a title, in this case just LMS API, we can add a description, API documentation, a version number, and some more settings here as well. But that's all we need for now. So we've wired up the configuration of the API documentation now. As I said, a lot of the hard work is actually done by all of the previous work that we've done with our models, serializers, and views. So now we just need to map the location of where we want to put this documentation in our urls.py. So if I open up the urls.py in the config folder, so basically our core project settings, and I'm going to first of all import a few of the views from DRF Spectacular. So we've got the Spectacular API view, Spectacular Swagger view, and the Spectacular Redoc view. And this will make more sense once we actually get to see what all of these look like. And then within the URL patterns, we essentially want to define a few URLs here. So once again, let's copy this. Let's come to the bottom of the URL patterns. And let's add these in. So we're adding a path for our OpenAI schema. This is going to be a file that somebody can download in order to understand the API schema that we have. We then have a path for our Swagger user interface, which will be an interactive user interface that somebody can navigate and explore through the APIs. And then similarly, we have our Redoc path as well, which is going to be another interactive documentation, and actually it looks very different to the Swagger documentation. So you could just choose one or the other, or you could have both here. That's all for now. So now let's actually see what's going on here. So let's run our server. Okay, now let's open this up in a web browser. Let's open up a new tab. So I've opened up the Django server. Obviously right now, this is not necessarily a usable path. However, as you can see, it's actually suggesting already the routes that we've defined for all the different documentation. So if I come here and I type in API/schema, you'll see that a file has been downloaded. And let me just open up this file. So here we have the YAML file that's been downloaded. It adheres to the OpenAPI standards, which is great. So this is something that you can hand over to a developer or to somebody else, essentially. Now this is quite a long file, so I'm not going to go through all of this, but this will start to come to life a little bit more when we look at the Swagger and the Redoc user interface. But this is our API schema, which is fantastic. Now let's check out some of the other paths too. So if I come back to my web browser, let's go to docs/Swagger. Oh, missing a / at the end. And I'm also missing an API. So instantly, you can see at the top, this is using the kind of metadata that we defined in our settings file in terms of the name or the title of the schema and the description. And then now you have all of this documentation for all of these views and all of the schemas, so essentially the responses that you'd expect off the back of it as well. In the Swagger UI too, you also get the ability to be able to authorize and test requests here as well. So as an example, you can input a username and a password, and it will basically store this within the browser so that you can then test the endpoints if the endpoints need authentication. So as an example, this API courses endpoint, you can see here it has a lock above it, which means that it requires authentication to access it. So if I open this up, it also gives me this interactive view of all the different parameters that can be passed as well. So we've got a Boolean flag for whether or not it's published, we can pass an ordering field, and all these other parameter values too. So not only does it tell you about the parameters that you can pass for an API endpoint, but it also tells you the response that you'll expect too. So as an example, this is what you could expect. So considering that we spent a decent amount of time defining our models, views, serializers, all this good stuff, this is pretty powerful that you can just generate all this documentation pretty much instantly. And then what you can see here at the top as well is that, as I said, you can also try these APIs out. So by clicking on try out, you can then come in here, you can choose values for all of these different parameters, and then you can execute and see what happens. So as an example, let's give this a go. Let me come back to VS Code and let me just get my authentication credentials. Let's see if this is going to work. Okay, so let's authorize. Let's come in, admin. Okay, those authorization credentials are now stored. Now let's try out this API. So I'm just going to keep this as blank for now. Let's just execute this. Now we got a response back. Let's see what it actually came back with. So it did actually come back with our response that we intended. So the authentication worked. It's given us a 200 code, and it's given us the information about the Django Basics course, the instructors, the modules, all the other metadata to do with this course. It also gives us some reporting in terms of the response headers that were sent back as well. So this is really powerful. Not only do you get all this full documentation, but then you can even test out these APIs by authenticating yourself within this user interface too. Now this is obviously just a get endpoint. For all the different views that we have generated, so whether this be get, post, put, patch, delete, or even get by ID as well, all of these will get automatically generated and documented in these sites. So if we have a look at one of the post endpoints, obviously this is going to be slightly different in terms of how it looks, because we don't require any parameters, but we will require a request body. So it gives you an example of what the request body should look like. You can also have a closer look at the schema and look at all the data types here as well, which is really useful. And then once again, the expected responses and the status codes that should come off the back of it. And similarly, now I'm not going to try this, but we can also try this out. We can edit our request body, we can send a request body to the backend, and we can test out these APIs, which is really cool. And then just to show you a few more examples, so let's have a look at a put example. In this one, because it requires a course primary key and an ID in the URL path, you can essentially configure these values in the parameters section, and then once again you can configure the request body as well. So probably what you'd expect here. And then if we come to delete, so let's have a look at API courses delete. Once again, you can specify the parameter for the ID, and you can try it out as expected. So everything's very clean, everything's all in one place. As I said before, you've got these schemas at the bottom as well that you can explore, which is also what we saw inline just a moment ago for the post request body. But essentially this is everything that a developer is going to need when they're coming onto a project, or you have someone that's collaborating with you on a project and you need to bring them up to speed with the APIs. So that is the Swagger documentation. Now let's have a look at the Redoc documentation. So here we have it, once again using all the same sort of metadata as we've had before, and everything is sort of contained under this API collapsible area here. So as I'm scrolling down, it's going to open up, which is really nice. Similarly, it essentially just splits out all the documentation into all of the different APIs that it has available. So it's obviously generating names for all these based on the way that we're naming our views. The documentation does look quite different, so you obviously have these sort of like subheaders. It gives you some information about the authorization. It gives you documentation about the query parameters, and then the responses that you can expect off the back of it as well, and the schemas for the different response key and values. The main difference here is obviously the aesthetic, but then on top of that, there isn't really an interactive way that you can actually test these APIs within this documentation. But it does give you code snippets, it does give you URLs. I tend to find that this style of documentation is much more common in modern sort of platforms these days. But another kind of neat feature here is that you can actually search through these APIs. So you could say, I don't know, lesson, and it should kind of narrow these down based on the lessons that I want. So just in this upper section here, I think it's, yeah, just in this upper section, it's just showing me all the API documentation related to lessons. So that's kind of it for the Redoc documentation. But we're not finished yet. Let us come back to our Visual Studio Code and let's make some more updates and some adjustments. So as I kind of explained before, the documentation is generated automatically. So DRF Spectacular works hand in hand with Django REST framework, which is what we used to implement our backend views before, and also the serializers, and it automatically extracts all the information that it needs from the view sets, the serializers, the fields and the data types, permissions, pagination, filters, and any custom actions that we use. So everything that we've done leading up to this point is basically contributing to the richness of the documentation. So if I come to one of the views that we created, if I come into core and go to the lesson view set, obviously all of this setup and configuration was really useful from the API's point of view because it added all of this different functionality into it and all of this abstraction as well by using the lesson serializer class. But then by laying it out so clearly, it also really helps the documentation to be generated as accurately and as intuitively as possible. So every detail of the definition is essentially used to help the documentation. So now we can go a few steps further as well. We can start adding some custom documentation for certain actions that we want to or may have added before into our views. So as it says here, custom actions do appear automatically, but we can improve them. So if we come to the lesson view set and we find our mark complete custom action. So if I come back here, this is our lesson view set. Let's just collapse these just to make it a little bit more easy to read. Here is our mark complete custom action that we created before. Now what I can do is I can add this snippet of code just above this. Now I'm going to have to make an import because we don't currently have that extend schema handler. So let's copy this and let's bring this over here. And I'm just going to put it at the top. And then let's just quickly zoom there. There we go. So if I save this, right, so now let's find our mark complete documentation. And if I have a look at the definition again, the extended definition, you can see it's essentially just adding this description on top of the description that was already there. So if I have a look at the Redoc documentation, you can see this is the endpoint in question, and then we've got this custom description here as well. Now let me switch over to the Swagger documentation and let's have a look for mark complete. I think that's the endpoint that we want. Yeah, it's the lesson mark complete. Yeah, that's right. And here we go, we've got our custom description here. So that's pretty simple. But let's keep going if we can. So now let's scroll down, and what we can also do is we can add tags to organize our documentation as well. So as an example, we can add this extend schema tags definition above the lesson view set once again. We could just define it like this, or we could in fact just copy this and put it into this previous definition that we had. And we can do a similar thing for the course view set as well. So I believe this was a little bit further up. And we collapse this. Yeah, and we want to put this actually above the class definition. So in fact, what we want to do is, if I come back down to the lesson view set, we are going to want to take this and let's put it up here, because we need to define it at the class level. But now we don't want it to be under courses, we want it to be under the lessons. Okay, now let's see how this affects the view here. So as you can see before, everything was basically compiled under this API sort of like object, but now we actually have it split out into 3 different categories. We have our APIs, which is where everything else lives that we haven't sort of like given a tag to, but then for the stuff that we have tagged, it lives under these drop downs, which is really nice. So we can organize our documentation in a slightly more clean way if we want to, using these tags. And then on top of that, we can go one step further and we can actually define our own custom component schemas if we wanted to. So as an example, if I come here and I copy this, so this is an example of a serializer that we're going to extend from the standard documentation that's generated. So I copy this block and I come to the lesson serializer, so that will be over here, and I paste this just above the lesson serializer. Now I'm going to need to update the imports as well. And what we're essentially defining here is a series of examples. So as you can see, there's the examples sort of like field here, and then we're passing in an array of examples that will be added to the documentation. So if I save this, and we're going to want to look at the lesson serializer, so the documentation that's been generated for the lesson serializer. So let's come back to our documentation. So let's refresh the screen. Now this definition that I gave, this custom schema, was for a lesson. So if I come to the lessons section, I open up the get API lessons endpoint, and if I scroll down, here we have the example that we just created. So here's an example of a response body that you could expect, and this is based on the simple lesson that I essentially just created. So then if I was to add another one as an example, let's just say, let's copy this, and let's put a second one in here. Let's call it 2, let's call it intro 2, and then let's call it welcome 2. And if I refresh this, you'll now see in this drop-down list, there should be now, no, I need to update the name, so there we go. That's what's going to make it unique. Now if I refresh it, now I should have 2 options in here to toggle between the examples within this part of the documentation. So this is a good way that you can give your documentation different examples of the responses that you can expect from the APIs. So we have simple lesson and simple lesson 2. You can see the values have been updated here, so that's great. So lastly, even though you're able to download the schema from the endpoint that we set up in the browser, if you did want to generate the JSON or YAML file locally, you can simply just run this command and it will essentially just generate that for you within your local file system too. And the reason why this is useful is you can take this schema and you can provide this to front-end TypeScript clients. So you can basically line up your typings on your front end to exactly match what's to be expected from the back end, which is going to be massively helpful down the line when you're building out front ends for your web applications. And then on top of that, some of the front end libraries that are available these days, you can actually use these schemas that you generate, and you can actually automatically generate typings for them as well. So as an example, this is sort of like a snippet that I found online that you could run based on the schema that you have running out on localhost for your Django server, and it'll automatically generate all the typings that you need, which is pretty amazing. So off the back of something which in reality is very simple, setting up this DRF Spectacular package, as I said before, we've kind of done all the legwork, we've done all the hard work by setting up our models, views and serializers in such a structured and clean way. So now we're really leveraging the power of this package to generate all this documentation for us. We can extend it and configure it as well on top of that, but now we can reap the rewards and have really powerful interactive developer documentation for our team. So I hope you found this part of the series useful. When it comes to building production-ready applications, API documentation like this is essential. So using a package like DRF Spectacular is just going to help you to get from A to B much quicker and really release the power of the server that you've spent so much time crafting yourself. Now, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, subscribe, and whilst you're here, check out some of my other Django videos as well. For example, my top tips as a CTO when building a Django server, and then of course all the previous parts to this course as well. But for now, I'll see you soon.